All right. So it's time for us to begin this evening. It's nice to see everybody, especially on a holiday. I appreciate everybody taking their time to be here tonight. Real quick, we're going to finish up our discussion from last week. It'll be very brief. We don't have a lot left to necessarily cover. But we started last week talking about applications that we make from this book, from our what has hopefully been right interpretation throughout the course of this quarter. And the first couple things we talked about were these, that we should remember why we are persecuted, that this book speaks to that the Christians, the saints in Asia Minor, and us as well, were persecuted due to sin around them, the rejection of Jesus. And Jesus even warned of that himself when he was here teaching, that do not be surprised when the world hates you. Remember that they first hated me. And that we should remember that the book never promises that persecution is going to completely go away while on earth. And in fact, some people are told they're going to go through complete, absolute tribulation in days to come. And I think the same would be true for us, that it's not going away anytime soon. But the bright side of all of that, the true message of this book is that the people of God, these people that the book is talking about, and us as well, are protected from just about anything outside of us being unfaithful. If we are faithful to God, that He will protect us, and that it is our soul that is protected. This book makes that very clear. There are many people throughout this book that are talked about who are beheaded because of Christ, who are put to death, who died for whatever reason, and who have already moved on from this earth, but who are in the hands of God and under His protection. Not necessarily that our bodies are protected. A few last couple things I'll talk about briefly that I think the book helps us remember, or encourages us to remember, is that remember that we will stand judgment, right? Our body is not protected. We could die, we could go through very hard things on this earth, but no matter what happens, whether we're talking about, which most of this book is, judgment being brought upon the enemies of God's people, or, as the book points to in chapter 21 and 22, the final judgment, we will stand all of those things if we are faithful to God. Chapter 7, chapter 14, a few of those places where it makes it very clear that God has marked His people for protection, that He will make sure those are the people who stand judgment, and we can be included in that. And we should remember that victory is assured to the faithful. This is very clear throughout this book. It's never a question in this book as to who's going to win the battle. Nobody's asking, or no, you don't hear anyone pleading, I hope God wins, right? There's no question that God will be victorious. Chapter 12 made that very clear, that Satan has already lost. The winner was already decided coming into all of this situation. And that's true for us. The winning side is selected. God will be the winning side. Satan has already lost and is just hoping to have us lose with him. And then finally, we should remember that God is in control. The very first vision, at least past chapter 1, in chapter 4, starts off this story with God sitting on His throne and in control. And all throughout the book, God is praised for being in control and exerting His control on the earth despite the difficult situation that people are going through. It doesn't always feel this way, does it? I know that's probably true for the saints in Asia Minor. I know it's definitely true for us at times, especially in a year like this that's been a little bit turbulent with something like an election, where you wonder what's going to be going on. Is the evil of the world going to be allowed to continue? What's going to happen to us as we move forward in this country, or any other country for that matter? We should always remember that God is in control. That was never in question in the book of Revelation. From beginning to end, God was always in control. He just allowed for others to have authority on earth for a time. And even though sometimes the question of the delay as to when God would take care of it was there, God always said, I will take control. My will be done no matter what, and this book assures that. And that is what happens with the situation with the Roman Empire. God was in control the whole time and ultimately did what He chose to do. And these 6 things that I talked about, obviously there could be many more. This is not an exhaustive list of things we learned from this book, right? But these things we made according to right interpretation. Hopefully, it's been clear. All through this class, I've done my best to present what I think is right interpretation for this book, but also the reasons for why these things are right interpretation, why these things can be concluded from the book. And at times we've talked about a few other things, right? Why certain other details or things that the world might teach are excluded from right interpretation. And I say that because tonight's lesson is going to be all about that other side of things, the false doctrines and many other teachings that come from the book of Revelation. Because there are a lot of things out there taught from this book, and a lot of things that I do not think follow right interpretation, and the things that I'll talk about tonight are included in that category, right? Like I said, we have been very careful in this class, right? We started off with our 4 keys, our background, time frame, audience, and style. Those things have helped us to make right interpretation, to understand that anything we take from this book must fit those things because they are laid out in the book by John himself, right? I didn't come up with those 4 keys. Those are the ideas and things presented in the book to help us understand what's going on. And there are many people in the world making wrong applications, unlike the 6 things that we looked at, and making very different teachings from this book because they fail to recognize these things that John points out: the audience, the background, the time frame, and the style of the book. Obviously, we're not going to talk about every false doctrine that exists from the book of Revelation, because like I said, there are a lot. We're going to talk really about just 2 primary things: Jehovah's Witness and premillennialism. All right, I picked these 2 because I think they are 2 of the most prominent teachings out there that come from this book. And I will tell you what my approach to this class is tonight, right? Because we're going to cover, ideally, both of these things in tonight's class, and we might spill over into next week a little bit. We're doing it fairly quickly for somewhat of a reason. Like I said, we just spent all last week and then the first couple minutes of this class talking about right interpretation and what kinds of applications we make on top of the right interpretation we've made throughout the book. And really all I want to do with these tonight is introduce kind of the main ideas of these topics, because I think what you'll find as I do that is that the 4 keys we've come up with and all of the things we've talked about throughout the entire quarter have really been a precursor to helping us see the faults in other types of teachings. And I think that's what this is going to do for us tonight, is really all I'm doing is laying the foundations of these arguments and these ideas, not the entire doctrine or things that are taught, so that we can see that. And we can see that these things are founded upon false ideas and false principles and false methods of interpretation. And I think that will help you in your studies as you continue to look at these things, or if you have conversations with people who teach these things. And obviously, we could have a lot more discussion and might in the future as well. I know Ben's got sermons on some of these things as well. We've got other content on our website digging into these things further. But I will also warn as well, there is the struggle with presenting false doctrines in a Bible class is I don't believe these things. I don't at times understand all of these things, but I will do my best to present them accurately. Also, I will present what is most commonly taught among these things. There is some variance amongst those who believe and teach these things as far as maybe minute details amongst them. So just be aware of that if you have conversations following tonight's class with anyone who teaches these things. They might differ a little bit from what I'm telling you. But hopefully I can present it as accurately as they would so that you know what their ideas are. We'll start off with Jehovah's Witness. We've talked about them a little bit in our class so far, but there are a few prominent things they teach from the book of Revelation. If you talk to somebody who is a Jehovah's Witness, who teaches things from this book or any other place in the Bible, I think they would probably tell you the book of Revelation is a difficult book. It is often hard to understand. If you're familiar at all with their website, the Jehovah's Witness have a website, jw.org. Check it out if you're interested to learn more about them, with caution, because there is some radical things on there. If you go to their website, they give you quite a few details as to how to understand the Bible and how to understand the things they teach. And on their website, they give this as what they believe to be the meaning of the book of Revelation. They said that, and this is a direct quote from their website, the Greek name of the Bible book of Revelation, Apocalypse, means uncovering or disclosure. The name indicates the meaning of Revelation. It uncovers matters that have been hidden and discloses events that would happen long after it was written. Many of its prophecies are yet to be fulfilled. hopefully you already see some issues there, but we'll get to those in just a minute. On their website, in addition to this, at the beginning of their discussion of Revelation, they also have some keys to Revelation, kind of the same way that I structured this class with 4 keys. They have their own keys that they have come up with to help us understand the book of Revelation, at least from their perspective. I'm going to share a few of them with you because they have many of them. What they call their key number 2, Revelation uses many signs or symbols that are not to be understood literally. They will tell you, keep this in mind as you move forward through the book of Revelation. I show that to you not because I disagree with it, because I think it's somewhat ironic in light of some of the things we'll see in a few minutes. Their key number 5, to understand the book of Revelation, we need the same things that help us understand the rest of the Bible, including wisdom from God and assistance from those who already understand it. Again, I don't really disagree with that, but again, let's keep that key in mind from their perspective as we go through their teachings. One, probably a little bit different, their key number 4, the visions of the book of Revelation apply to the Lord's Day, which began when God's kingdom was set up in 1914, and Jesus began ruling as king. Therefore, we can expect the main fulfillment of Revelation to be now in our time. In 2024 is what they're referring to, in our time now. This one, I will say right off the bat, I disagree with, unlike the first 2. Does anything in that key stand out to you as striking? That seems a little odd. Why 1914, right? That's the same question I had. The teachings of the Jehovah's Witness are very heavily centered around this idea of the church starting in the year 1914. And from what they will tell you is that is what the book of Revelation helps us understand. And I'm going to break that down for you so you can see where that came from. So if we look back, if we think about... I'll put that up in just a second. If we look back to the Old Testament, right, to the days of the Israelites and the days of Jerusalem and the kings of Israel and of Judah, right, God's people were waiting for a worthy ruler to come and put to an end the enemies of his people and to put to end the evil of the world, right? That Ezekiel, they look at Ezekiel 17 and 31, that a prophecy that God's people would suffer for a period of 7 times before God would send the worthy ruler to come and put an end to it. Obviously, they're overlooking some figurative language and things in Ezekiel. They teach that Jesus is this ruler that would come as God, come and establish God's earthly kingdom or spiritual kingdom. But when he came to earth 2,000 years ago, what we read about in our Bibles in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and what's talked about other places, was not this. He did not come to be that ruler. He did not come to establish the kingdom at that time, but merely to talk about it and to talk about how that would come in the future. That was his role here, as well as being a sacrifice for others. So as Jesus died, many expected he would be that ruler. And when he died, that leaves open the question, right? If Jesus didn't come to establish the kingdom, when is that going to happen? Clearly, the Christians in the New Testament age would have been wondering the same thing, which is why the book of Revelation comes into play, right? The purpose of Revelation, they would teach you, is to help us primarily to understand Jesus' bringing of the church. And so this book lays out exactly how that's going to happen. If we think to Ezekiel telling us that 7 times is the period that we would have to wait before Jesus comes, the question would be, how long is 7 times? We have seen this reference to many times in the book of Revelation, and they'll point to those same things. As we talk about 7 times, we've seen this reference to 3.5 times. We've seen the same reference to 1,260 days or 42 months. We've seen that a couple of times throughout the book. Do you remember what we said that was when we talked about it? Brought about one single idea primarily. incomplete, right? Partial. In all of the context that this time period is mentioned, it means incomplete, talking about the rule of the beast being not one that would last forever. It would come to an end. The persecution that the dragon would bring would be limited. It would come to an end at a time, right? That's what we interpreted that 3.5 times. For them, it is a literal time period that is being talked about. 3.5 times is the 1,260 days that are being talked about. So if we double that, 7 times must be equal to 7,520 days. But, as you know, the kingdom of God did not come 2,500 days later. So they've missed a step in their calculation. So we have to find the missing key. Again, just moving forward to the next slide, that's the same detail. 7 times equals 2,520 days. But we can use a conversion given to us in our Bibles. 1 day will equal 1 year. The reason we know this, according to Jehovah's Witness, if you think back to the Old Testament, right, or many times God's people are punished for not obeying God. One prominent time that we can probably recall upon, when God's people were sent out to wander in the wilderness, how long did they have to wander? 40 years. Do you know why it was 40 years? 1 year for every day that the spies were in the land is how long God's people had to suffer, right? That is a direct calculation that can be carried over to the book of Revelation. That is a biblical, scriptural conversion we can make. Therefore, 7 times equals 2,520 years. Okay, a lot of numbers, a lot of math. Okay, but this is how they would lay that out for us. The period of 7 times that God's people would have to suffer before he brought about a worthy ruler would be 2,520 years. So putting that in its context, the book of Ezekiel, the period that it's talking about, that period of suffering began in October 607 BC, right? That's the time when God's people went into captivity to the Babylonian Empire. That was the beginning of suffering for God's people at the hands of their enemies. And so if we count forward 2,520 years later, we get to October 1914. Okay? Long path. Hope you followed it. If not, go back and rewatch the video tomorrow, and you can kind of see it. Jehovah's Witness also lay this out on their website, right? That's where 1914 came from. That the Bible, through all of these very complex calculations, has laid out for us that very clearly Jesus came back to establish the church in 1914. When he did that, it was invisible, right? So you're not going to see it in your history books because he was not visible to anyone when he came to do that. That's why you didn't see it. That's why you can't look back and find it. But that is when it happened. So, yes.
So what happened on that day?
I don't know. Right? So it's a little confusing, and this is where I say that there's a little bit of variance between people who believe and teach this. And on this subject, it is very hard. It seems that there were a very select few people who really knew exactly what was happening. But I don't think they would even say that they know entirely. At least most of them wouldn't. Some of them might. Right? Because Jesus, his return was invisible. It was not visible to us, therefore we didn't know it happened. That's why so much of the world doesn't know that Jesus has already returned, and that is when the church started, right? It's very hard to tell for that reason. So I don't know how to answer that question entirely, and so ask one of them, or go check out their website. So in 1914, that is when Jesus returned, right? 2,000 years ago, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John talks about Jesus here, talking about, Jesus' conversations were about this date. 1914. All of him talking about his return is 1914. So in 1914 he comes, he established the church, right? The church did not start 2,000 years ago when he was here. It started in 1914. And it is from that moment on that, do you remember the other thing we talked about from Jehovah's Witness, right? There was a number. 144,000 people are going to heaven from 1914 on. Right? There's some would disagree with that. Some of them believe it's across all time. Some of them believe it's 1914. Don't know how you make the distinction necessarily. But most would teach that from 1914 on, it is that point that God has started counting his 144,000 people. right? That's what chapter 7 was about in Revelation. You remember that. The 144,000 people who God marked, who he sealed, who would receive their reward. Yes?
They say what happened to people before 1914.
Well, that's why some would disagree with that, and they would say, well, it's actually 144,000 across all time, right? God's looking backwards to count and pick his people. There's not really a good resolution on that issue. I'm not entirely sure. For the other people, I don't know how they would resolve that question, honestly. Yes?
I'm just so lost. If he was invisible, how did they know he came in 1914?
Because Revelation teaches us that.
But he was invisible.
Well, but Revelation told us he was coming in 1914. Right, I'm being facetious on purpose, right? That is how they would present it, right? We don't know that it happened. We didn't know it happened. We couldn't see it. But the Bible, as we look through our calculations, very clearly lays out for us that that's what happened. So we can be confident in that, and we can trust that, because that's what the Bible teaches to be truth. That's what Revelation's all about. So we can definitely be confident in that, right? That's not true, okay? I'm arguing with you to make their point, right? That's how they would respond to that. All these calculations, they're biblical, they're scriptural, right? We're not making these things up. This came from a certain place in our Bible, right? And we talked about the other, the 144,000, right, would be their group of people. So let's break down a few of these things, as I'm sure you already are doing in your head. I'm going to put their keys back up on the board here for a second. These are the things they said must be followed in order to understand the book of Revelation. Not to be understood literally. That whole conversation seems very literal to me. And in fact, a pretty odd mix of literal and figurative at times. It's kind of hard to follow. If you found it hard to follow, trust me, I get it. It is hard to follow, right? We have to understand the rest of the Bible. We clearly have to look at the rest of the Bible to understand things Jesus taught about the coming of the church and about the kingdom. And clearly, this is all what he was talking about as well, right? The irony should not be lost on you, right? They are jumping back and forth from literal to figurative at times, and clearly they misunderstood Jesus' purpose here 2,000 years ago. That he very often said things like that the coming of the kingdom is at hand, right? You move forward even past his death to the apostles. That's what they're writing about to the church, to address things that the church is to be doing and how it's to be structured. We have history in the book of Acts about how the church grew and how the apostles established different local congregations within that church. There's so many details in our Bible, again, we're not going to look at in detail tonight, that this doctrine would contradict. Right? You have to remove this from much of what the rest of the Bible teaches to have it make sense. Now they talk about God's people awaiting a worthy ruler, right? I would agree with that. God's people were awaiting a worthy ruler, right? They just have completely misunderstood what the Bible was telling us that rule would be for Jesus and the church, which he established 2,000 years ago that we are now a part of, right? Clearly they are misusing and abusing the rest of the Bible. So obviously we have not looked at everything Jehovah's Witness, right? But let's look at this from the perspective of our 4 keys. The 4 keys that I believe John lays out in the book, as we talked about in lesson 1, right? This doctrine of the church starting in 1914. How does that break our time frame? Should be the obvious one.
These things are surely to come to pass.
Right? They said, their description of the book of Revelation is that it clearly is about things that are still yet to take place even in our future. That goes completely against the foundation John establishes in chapter 1 and carries through to chapter 22, right? These things are coming soon. We've talked about those things. Very clearly, this does not fit that time frame. If we look at kind of the audience and the background, think about what the saints of Asia Minor are going through. The difficult things they're going through. Chapter 1, John starts talking. I know your tribulation. I know the difficult things that you're going through. I know how hard your life is. Chapter 2, chapter 3, I know the good things. I know the bad things. Stay faithful. Don't worry. Help is coming, but none of you are going to experience it. Right? Chapter 4. Now let's start talking about something else. Now let's start talking about something that does not relate to your tribulations anymore, to the hard things, to the historical context with which in this book is written, right? We have now taken this book and moved it to a scope that is not relevant to the saints in Asia Minor anymore. They will not take part in the church or in its reward if it's not to start for another 1900 years or whatever. That does not make sense. That does not contextually fit within this book, which is one of many reasons why the things we've looked at so far with the Jehovah's Witness fall apart. It does not fit right interpretation with this book. Obviously, the style, they said, this book is not to be understood literally. Why even say that if you're going to take so many very literal things from this book and be inconsistent about it, right? It's not like they're even consistently taking everything in this book literally. We talked about that in chapter 7. 144,000 who? Who does chapter 7 say is a part of the 144,000? Israelites. Well, how come that one sentence can be cut in half? 144,000 is literally us. But Israelites, just throw that part away. We don't need that. That part's figurative because it doesn't fit this narrative, right? It's an inconsistent argument to be jumping back and forth at unprescribed times as to when it is figurative and when it is not. It just does not work. It is an inconsistent argument. Again, this is kind of the approach that I wanted to take to this class, is that's foundationally what Jehovah's Witnesses believe. Obviously, there's a lot more. But if you bring back to the foundations of their teaching, the beginning of the church, according to their interpretation, if that's flawed, I have very little confidence in anything else that they try to teach to me. Right? Obviously, we could break down a lot more about it, but we're not going to. This is the primary thing they would teach us from the book of Revelation, which is why I'm presenting it. They have made wrong interpretation. They have broken their own keys. In fact, their keys contradict itself, right? Not to be understood literally. We have to understand the rest of the Bible. God's kingdom was established in 1914. The third key there breaks the first two. Right? They have not been consistent. Hopefully you've seen through this class, we have made a very intentional effort to be consistent, to always focus on our four keys. That's why I save applications often for the end of the quarter, is try to get through the book without the distraction of that and leaving those keys. But we have made right interpretation. They clearly have not. The foundations of this argument are flawed. Any questions or anything so far on Jehovah's Witness? Because we're going to move on and talk about premillennialism in a very similar light. Obviously, I know there could be more to talk about. Let's talk about premillennialism, because we're going to see kind of the same thing here. Again, this is just foundational things, foundational principles to take into these kinds of discussions. It is not exhaustive by any means. This doctrine... different doctrine, right? So we're going to shift our mindset a little bit. It's very focused on Jesus' second coming in a different way than the last one was. This doctrine teaches that at some point in our future, Jesus will return to earth. He will take his seat as the ruler in Jerusalem, and he will do so for 1,000 years. He will reign on earth for 1,000 years. Do you recognize where in Revelation that comes from? That principle of Jesus reigning for 1,000 years.
Well, let's take 1,000 years from chapter 20.
Right. This primarily comes from chapter 20. Obviously, there's a lot of other details, right? But the focus of it is this 1,000-year reign in chapter 20. And we talked about this 1,000-year reign, right? That if we bring it back to its context, God has discussed bringing an end to the Roman Empire, the tool that Satan was using to persecute God's people. That tool was taken away. Satan was figuratively bound by having Rome removed. And in the same sense, God's people were figuratively reigning for 1,000 years. They were completely victorious. Satan was completely defeated in this context, right? That's what we recognize that to be as right interpretation. Well, for them, they believe this is a literal reign that chapter 20 is talking about, and is talking about Jesus coming back, taking that reign for 1,000 years, where his people will reign with him. And at that time, the Battle of Armageddon will take place. I can't lay out for you everything they teach about the Battle of Armageddon because it's rather lengthy. But what we talked about, right, this was the week Stephen taught when I was sick, right? He mentioned it very briefly, that the reference to Armageddon was a reference to the Valley of Megiddo. This was a location where key battles took place in Christians' history, right, the Israelites and that history, God's people's history, where we see that time and time again, God's people were victorious when they were faithful to Him. When faithful to God, God's people will be victorious. That's what this Armageddon reference was. For them, Armageddon is the name that they place on the entire battle that's being discussed in the book of Revelation. Right? As we start the seals, and then the trumpets and the bowls, all the destruction, all of those things, that is a very literally described battle that will happen at the end of time, right? So if you go through and read their narrative from someone on what the Battle of Armageddon will look like, you will see the details from the seals and then the trumpets and then the bowls, right? That all of those things are very literally going to take place at the end of time. And we are still waiting for that to happen. It is not until that 1,000 years that Jesus will reign. At the end of that 1,000 years, Satan is unbound, and Satan will remain here with the unfaithful on earth, and he will reign here, and all of God's people will go to heaven. Okay, that is how that will play out. And because we are waiting still on that 1,000-year reign, that millennial reign, we currently are pre-millennial. Okay, so that's where that name premillennial comes from, because we are waiting on the millennial reign of Christ that Revelation chapter 20 is talking about. One thing that I think is interesting, again, to talk about how they would present this or teach this, same question I would have for somebody of Jehovah's Witness that I addressed earlier is, right, well, if Jesus is not coming until then, he's going to reign then, the church will be established more fully then, all the promises will be fulfilled then, right? What was his real purpose here 2,000 years ago, right? Why did he come then? And the way that they would explain that is that Jesus came to start his 1,000-year reign back then. That's what we read about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He came to start his 1,000-year reign, but it didn't really work out. Why? Anybody know why? People rejected him and they killed him, right? He tried to start the 1,000-year reign. It didn't work out the way he thought it would. People were not responsive, so ultimately they killed him, right? Jesus came to do this, but he failed to do so. So now he will have to come back naturally at some point in the future to finish what he failed to do at that time. Again, Jesus failed. Okay, that's the beginning of this teaching. So let that soak in for a little while. Not everyone you talk to is going to be happy about agreeing to that idea, right? If you bring that up, you will probably just start arguments. But that is the unavoidable truth of that situation, right? Jesus came to start this. He couldn't do it. People rejected him. So he will have to come back to finish it. So let's talk about, okay, comment? Yeah.
So is it that they don't think of the kingdom of God as like a spiritual, like a bringing of the spiritual kingdom of God? They think of it as a physical thing. And so therefore, like when Jesus came, we understand that to be Christ began his spiritual kingdom with the church, right?
Yep.
But they don't see it that way?
Jesus' kingdom will be him reigning on earth. He will literally reign from Jerusalem on his throne, literally on earth. And there's some discrepancies on that we're going to get to in just a minute as we move forward into it. But that's the idea, right? That the kingdom of Christ has not come yet. We are waiting for that to be fulfilled fully on 1,000 years. Us, as a part of the church nowadays, we are waiting for that. We are the group of people waiting to rule with him. Comment as well.
The Jehovah's Witnesses also have a premillennial outlook. The 144,000 get to go straight to heaven, but those who were faithful but didn't make the cut and then have to work with Jesus in that 1,000-year reign to save more souls.
Yeah, and so there is some overlap there. Some of Jehovah's Witnesses will believe premillennialism, some will not. Not all will agree to that, though, right? But again, yeah, there is some overlap. Some of those people will believe these ideas as well and layer that on top of what we've already talked about. But let's talk about that 1,000-year reign that we are waiting for. This book, Revelation, is describing in great detail the timing, and what that reign is going to look like, according to our premillennialist friends. There are really two categories of premillennialism. There is historical premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism. Those are mouthfuls. Historical premillennialism is basically what we've talked about thus far. It's rather simple in nature. That 1,000-year reign, we're still waiting on it. Someday at an unknown time, Jesus is going to come back. 1,000 years will start. Don't know when that's going to be. Dispensational premillennialism, probably the more common, adds a few details to it that we'll talk about. Primarily, historical is where it started, around the 2nd century. Very soon after the book of Revelation was written, people started interpreting it in this way. And this view was taught for a long time, around the end of the first millennium, around the year 700 to 1,000, somewhere in there. This idea slowly started dying off. People started widely rejecting it, very largely due to the fact that the Catholic Church comes onto the scene. They began teaching something very different, and this idea it kind of goes away for the most part. Not completely, but it's not very common. Until the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, people started opposing the Catholic Church and bringing what they believed back, restoring right teaching and things like that. People came back to premillennialism. It started coming back up, but it started changing a little bit, which is where we get to dispensational premillennialism. People started adding a little bit to it. What this idea of dispensational premillennialism will teach, that was all of the stuff I just said, they teach that the Bible lays out for us 7 dispensations of time. If we look at from creation to Adam, that is the dispensation of innocence. From Adam to Noah, of conscience, Noah to Abraham, of government, Abraham to Moses, of patriarchal rule. From Moses to Christ is the dispensation of Mosaic law. And then from the current age of the church forward to where we are now is the dispensation of grace, or the age of the church. And then we will have dispensation 7, which will be that 1,000-year reign we are waiting for. These are the time periods they believe the Bible has laid out, and the book of Revelation will tell us where we fall currently in this list. If you think back to our reading of the book of Revelation, it talks a lot about the 7th being the end. Right? We've got mentions in chapter 10 about when the 7th angel sounds, it will bring about the end, the resolution to the situation. We interpreted that rightfully to be the end of this matter with Rome. The 7th trumpet was going to bring about God's final judgment on Rome and the resolution to the matter that the book is contextually talking about. They would interpret that be the end of time, or the end days of this 1,000-year reign is what that's talking about. That this book, Revelation, is pointing us to that 1,000-year reign. And is telling us that is coming soon. This book is telling us in 2024 that coming soon is this 1,000-year reign. That is what they are teaching from this. It's important to note, kind of throw a timeline up here and try to explain this a little bit. The transition between dispensations is very important for a dispensational premillennialist. If you look here at a timeline, right, we're currently in the 6th. We're looking forward to that time when the 7th will start, when that 1,000-year reign of Christ will start. Okay, there will come a day where we will hit this transition point. There will be 7 years, according to the book of Revelation, prior to this. This idea comes from other places in the Bible as well. There will be 7 years prior to this where the world will break into utter chaos. Right, all structure and formality and everything will end. Sin, wickedness, everything will be allowed to rule completely. It will be a world of evil for 7 years until Jesus comes to save the day in the 1,000-year reign. Okay? Again, a little bit of a disagreement amongst some, primarily between historical and dispensational as to this next point. But dispensational premillennialists believe that this book tells us, right? We look at chapter 7, chapter 14, talking about God marking his people. God is not going to allow his people to go through that kind of wicked, through that kind of sin, that kind of evil. So, prior to the 7 years of tribulation, God is going to rapture his people. You've probably heard about the rapture. He's going to rapture his people, take his people off the earth, protect them completely from everything that's about to come, before anything happens, right? Historical premillennialists do not believe in the 7 years of tribulation or the rapture. Dispensational do. Again, if you talk to people about premillennialism, don't start throwing historical and dispensational, those words at them. They may not recognize them. This is just the origins of it. It's why I'm giving you those words. But if they talk about the rapture or 7 years of tribulation, they would fall in the dispensational category of how they believe it to be. God is not going to allow his people to go through bad things. Right? That is primarily the difference between dispensational premillennialists and historical. Historical, God's people are going to have to go through all of it. There's going to be some bad stuff. God's people are going to have to go through it. During the 1,000-year reign, God's people will remain on earth for all of the battle of Armageddon and all of the things that Jesus brings about. God's people and the wicked will live on earth through all of it. Dispensational would disagree. They would say, nope, God's not going to let his people go through that. They believe chapter 7, chapter 14 make that very clear. God's going to mark his people and protect them. So God's people during the 1,000-year reign will be in heaven. All of the wicked, all of the evil, everybody else who's not a part of God's people will be left behind, and they will be on earth to live out their days on earth. This idea of the rapture and this idea of getting left behind in the rapture, very widely believed by people. There are many teachings out there. There's books, there's classes, there's doctrines, things out there to help you be prepared for the rapture, right? How to be prepared and know that the rapture is coming, and what to do if the rapture does come. What do you do if the rapture comes and you get left behind, right? What if we're in this room and all of a sudden half the room disappears? God has taken them up to heaven, and what do the rest of us do? Well, we're stuck here now. Now what, right? There's books about that. There's things about how planning for your estate, what's going to happen to your money in your bank and things like that after the rapture happens, once you're gone and off to heaven and not caring about any of that stuff anymore. Here's something interesting that I found in my research. After the rapture, pet care. If the rapture happened right now, what would happen to your pets? Look, you're all laughing. I laughed when I saw this too, right? This is a real thing that people truly believe. If you go to their website, you will see a nice video of pets watching their owners disappear. Very sad. It's structured in such a way where you can register your pets, and once you get raptured, there will people who will come to your house, take your pets, and take care of them, right? People who have already decided that they will not take part in Christianity or the rapture, they will stay behind as a noble sacrifice to take care of your pets, right? I'm making a little bit of a joke out of that, right? And I apologize to anybody who's a part of this organization, right? But it's hard to talk about this without it sounding kind of funny for those of us who don't believe it, right? But I give this picture and this website as an example to say people truly believe this, right? You go read through the description on this website. These people are very sincere in caring for people's pets after they get raptured, right? If you talk to people about premillennialism, you're going to have an uphill battle. People believe these things. It seems very crazy to us. It seems very silly to us. It is a hard conversation to have with people because these things are ingrained in their minds and their religion. It's going to be very difficult. I see a lot of hands, so just bear with me for just a second. I'm sorry. We're not going to be done with this conversation. We're going to finish it next week. What I've done so far up to this point is laid out for you what premillennialism teaches. We're going to break it down next week because it's going to take us a little bit to do that. You've probably already got your wheels running. I think that's why there are so many hands up in the air. So for just a second, the last 2 minutes, I'll take a few comments.
My only comment would be just to understand how many people believe this.
Exactly.
Go talk to your neighbors, go talk to your friends, go talk to your coworkers who call themselves a Christian. They probably believe this. I believed this until I was 36 years old. There's hundreds of millions of people who believe this.
Yeah, this premillennialism is very common, often amongst people who would consider themselves Baptist, right? That's where it's very prevalent. Not that it's exclusive to that at all. But yeah, there are millions of people teaching these things, believing this, awaiting the rapture, thinking at any moment I could disappear, because the book of Revelation tells me that's going to happen. Sean, you have something?
I would say, remember that because people think they come up with these things, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, any type of any mythology is really cool when you think about it in your head. Jesus coming down and flames of golden eagles and just blowing up stuff sounds awesome. And it's that enticement of the wonder that gets people, and you have to come to them and show them that this isn't how this works. God's never done that. And you have, it's kind of like the childhood wonder that you got to get over.
Yeah, it's a very flashy idea, right? Premillennialism, right? I presented it to you in about 20 minutes. We could talk for weeks about the things that this doctrine teaches, the other ideas, and the other things that are taught with it. It's very detailed. It is very flashy, to Sean's point, right? The Battle of Armageddon, you could read books laying out in grand detail what this is going to look like if you want things outside Revelation. It's pretty bizarre at times, but like was mentioned, this is very prevalent. A lot of religious people you talk to will believe this or something similar. So we're going to break it down next week. I know there were a couple other hands. I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody, but hold those thoughts, whatever you got, and bring them back next week because we're going to keep talking about this. Thank you.